I sat in my room, alone and a little sleepy. It was about 1 a.m. and snowing outside. I sat there playing the recently released BioShock Infinite. I had no light on in my room. I enjoyed playing in the dark. It makes me feel as if I am in the game. Anyway, I was sitting up in my bed, resting against the headboard. My room was about 20 by 18 feet, and I had my bed, a nightstand, a 32-inch flat-screen TV, a dresser, and a closet. My room had 2 windows on either side of the bed, but I had blackout shades on them so I could sleep better. My nightstand was to the right of the bed, and the TV was directly across from my bed on top of the dresser. To the left of the dresser was the closet, and to the right of the dresser was the door. I was living the life. I was in my mid-20s, a bachelor, and an apartment all to myself. The only other person that shares the apartment with me is my pit bull, Butch. He looks frightening from afar, but he could never hurt a fly. His name doesn't really suit him too well, but alas, he's a loyal dog. His dog bed was to the left of my bed, and it faced the door. He laid there in a deep sleep, and he was snoring. His snoring was like the sound of a train going right through my bedroom. I have contemplated kicking him out and making him sleep in the living room more than once. He suddenly awoke and sat straight up. He started barking, and that was when I could hear the sound of someone at the front door. It seemed like they were trying to break in. I rushed into the hallway and then into the living room. The doorknob was shaking violently. I slowly approached the door and looked through the peephole. It was my crazy ex-girlfriend. Jane was the type of girl who would become attached to anything or anyone that paid attention to her. She grew up with no father, as he left when she was young. So, she naturally attaches more to males. She looks for someone who could fit that father role or a man who can care for her. She had long blonde hair that went down to her big breasts. She had a kind face with nice blue eyes. She had a fit body and was about 5'6". She was the type of girl who would always wear yoga pants and a tank top. I never complained. A girlfriend who wore yoga pants every day is some guy's dream come true. But where she excelled in beauty, she lacked in being healthy mentally. She would always act like a child and hold on to your hand everywhere, even when we were alone. She would laugh at everything I said. That got super annoying. She would also ask me to marry her every single day since we started dating. She was crazy. These visits are pretty often since the day we broke up. The day we broke up, she told me that she would never find someone else. I had to change the locks because she kept the keys and would walk into my room and watch me sleep at night. This visit was strange though, because she would always come around dinner time since I changed the locks. It was 1 a.m. What was she doing? I made the mistake of grabbing the doorknob. She then stopped trying to get in and yelled, "KC, I know you're in there. Open up." Shit. Now what was I supposed to do? I unlocked the 3 locks I had on the door and opened the door. She stood there smiling. "Hey, honey." She strut right in like she owned the place and sat down on the couch in my living room. "So what's my love up to tonight?" "Zrenia, она спросила. Just playing BioShock. Why are you here?" Something was off about her tonight. She wasn't wearing her normal yoga pants and a tank top. She was wearing gray jeans and a black sweatshirt. "I'm here to see you, my love." Swinging her hips, she said, smiling. I hate when she called me her love. I had made the mistake of saying, "I love you," about 2 weeks before we broke up. I then spoke up, "No, seriously, why are you here?" She suddenly stopped smiling and looked angry. I'm here to make you love me and marry me." I suddenly had a bolt of rage flow through me. "What? You know that will never happen. I will never love you." I screamed it at her. That cut deep into Jane. She sunk down into the couch. She then got up and pouted as she was walking towards my kitchen. "Where do you think you're going?" "I'm going to grab something to eat." I decided to follow her into the kitchen. I did not trust her. As I entered the kitchen, I saw her reach for my set of knives. "Jane, what are you doing?" She turned around with a butcher knife in her hand. "You said you loved me. Why don't you love me?" She lunged forward with the knife, just scratching my forearm. I ran out into the living room. "I know you're mad, but you don't need to do this," I said. She slowly walked towards me. Her hands were shaking. "You said you loved me. You lied." She ran at me, holding up the knife in her right hand. The living room was quite big and open, so when her arm extended towards me, I ran to the left of her. I rushed into my room. Butch had gone back to sleeping. He must have thought the visitor was not dangerous since I opened the door. Boy, was he wrong. I ran into my bedroom looking for any object to defend myself with. I found a pocket knife that I stored in the drawer of my nightstand, just in case of burglars. Butch awoke and started barking. I turned around to see Jane standing in the doorway. "You lied." She kept repeating those two words over and over again. I held up the pocket knife in my right hand so she could clearly see it. "What do you think you're going to do with that?" She laughed wickedly. "You're going to love me, even if I have to kill you," she said as she slowly approached me. Her logic made no sense to me. If she loved me so much, why would she kill me? She lunged at me screaming, "You lied!" And as she lunged, I struck her in the chest with the pocket knife. I stabbed her right in the heart, and she fell to the ground. Laying on the ground, she looked at the wound and then back at me. She slowly whispered, "Why?" And I looked at her directly in the eye and said, "I never loved you." She then took her last breath and died right next to my bed. A pool of blood sunk into the white carpet beneath her. I dragged her to the closet and stuffed her in it. I closed the door to the closet. I had a lump in my throat. I had just killed someone. How was I going to sleep at night from now on? I turned and walked towards my bed. That's when I heard the closet door open. I turned around to see Jane standing there. "You lied." She then lunged towards me with the butcher knife still in her hand. I woke up sweating and breathing heavily. It was just a dream. I kept telling myself that, trying to calm my nerves. I started breathing normally again, and I looked around to see if it was really a dream. I looked on the carpet at the place where Jane used to lay. No blood in sight. I then walked towards the closet and opened the door to find no sight of Jane. I walked towards my bed and settled in and started to sleep. That's when I heard it. I heard the sound of the front doorknob rattling. Something happened to me and my dad when we went on a camping trip a few years ago. I was around 12 years old at the time. We arrived at the campsite early in the afternoon and quickly set up our tent near a big lake. The air was crisp and fresh, and the trees surrounding us were tall and majestic. As the sun started to set, my dad built a campfire and began to cook some hot dogs on a grill. We sat on our camping chairs and enjoyed the warmth of the fire, listening to the sounds of nature around us. The stars slowly began to appear in the sky, and my dad pointed out some of the constellations he knew. After we finished eating, my dad told me to go to bed in the tent while he stayed outside to put out the fire. I crawled into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes, listening to the soothing sound of crickets outside. That's when I heard it, a soft, whispering voice right outside the tent. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but it got louder and more urgent. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but the voice kept calling my name. I started to feel scared, so I called out to my dad, but he didn't answer. I crawled out of the tent and looked around, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. Then I heard my dad's voice from across the lake. He was yelling for me to come to him. I could hear the urgency in his voice, and I knew I had to go to him. I started to run towards his voice, but the whispering voice behind me got louder and more frantic. I turned around and saw a shadowy figure chasing me. I screamed and ran faster, but it was like the figure was always right behind me. I didn't know what to do or who to trust. Finally, I made it to my dad, who was standing on the other side of the lake. He pulled me close and hugged me tightly, but something felt off. His embrace was cold and unfamiliar. When he pulled away, I saw that his face was different than I remembered. It was like he had aged 10 years overnight. His eyes were sunken and his skin was wrinkled. I tried to shake it off and convince myself that it was just the stress of the situation, but something felt off. As we packed up our things and left the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between my dad and me. He was quieter than usual, and there was a distance between us that hadn't been there before. To this day, I'm not sure what happened to my dad, or if it's even my dad that I went home with. Every time I look at him, there's a sense of unease and uncertainty that lingers in my mind. Sometimes I wonder if the shadowy figure that chased me in the woods had something to do with it, or if it was all just a nightmare. But I know one thing for sure. That camping trip was the last time I ever saw my dad as he used to be. Growing up near the Alabama-Mississippi border, I often stayed with my grandmother. Her house, with its looming mulberry tree and unsettling whispers, was a place of both comfort and unease. I frequently had nightmares there, often waking to the sound of branches scraping against my window. One evening, after a delicious dinner at Grandma's, I tried to sleep. The familiar scratching on the window resumed, and then I heard my name whispered. I woke up face down in the creek, terrified. I had been warned about the snakes. I sat there, crying, wishing someone would find me. But I knew I had to find my way back home. I had been to the creek enough times to know my way back, but it was so dark that I was unsure which way I was meant to go. At the time, I thought the smartest thing for me to do was to turn my back to the creek and walk straight. So that's what I did. I walked for what felt like a lifetime, but I kept having to stop and watch the ground to make sure I didn't step on a snake. As I walked, I kept getting more and more upset. I would cry until I couldn't see, wipe my eyes, and cry again. I started to hear the crunching of leaves that wasn't coming from me. Looking back now, it was very stupid of me, but I started calling out for my mom and grandmother. I hoped that they were out here looking for me and that they would hear me if I yelled loud enough. But if either of them were out there, neither responded. Eventually, I got to the point where I couldn't keep going. I collapsed next to a tree and cried until I almost threw up. My crying was interrupted by more crunching of leaves. This time, they were getting closer though, and I realized that they were footsteps. I froze up and tried to keep my crying quiet. I thought that if I was still enough, then I wouldn't be seen. So I sat there covering my mouth to stifle my sobs and laying on the ground as still as I could. The footsteps got closer and closer, and then they stopped. They stopped right next to me, and I cried harder. "What are you doing out here alone?" He asked me a question, but it didn't sound like a question. His voice was calm and warm. It sounded familiar, but I was sure that I had never heard it before. Looking up at him after realizing that my attempts to hide were useless, I saw that he looked similar to my grandmother. He was a little taller, much younger, and his eyes were a bit darker. I think that's why all the stranger danger training went out the window. I sobbed and tried to explain that I had woke up by the creek, but it was unintelligible. "Oh, it's okay." He knelt down, pulling me into a hug before standing up again. He rubbed my back for a while, telling me that everything would be okay. I felt like he was right, that as soon as he showed up, everything was fine. He continued to console me while carrying me through the woods. After a while, I had stopped crying altogether, laying my head on his shoulder and trying to stay awake from how exhausted I had become. I never told him where my grandmother's house was, but he knew the way, calmly walking through the woods and making his way to the clearing that bordered my grandmother's property. I could see my grandmother's house. The lights were on in the house. My grandmother was standing past the well near the tree line that the man and I had exited. I was happy to see her. I knew that I should have shaken off the man's grip and ran to her, but I didn't. I was content where I was, and I didn't know why. He had stopped when he saw my grandmother, and when I looked at him, I saw that he was smiling warmly at her. I couldn't hear exactly what my grandmother had said, but it was something to the effect of, "Put her down." He did, setting me down on the ground gently and ruffling my hair before putting both of his hands in his pockets. I stayed next to him. I couldn't hear my grandmother until she yelled, and I remember being scared because she was mad at me. "Get over here." My grandmother was always very soft-spoken. As soon as she yelled, I ran over to her and did as she said without whining when she hissed at me to get into the house. "No need to be so harsh on her, Eve. She's a good kid." I heard the man's calm voice before I started running back to the house. I watched them through the window once I got inside. But once my grandmother started walking back to the house, I got away from the window and stood near the door. I wanted to cry again, knowing that I had upset her so much. I kept apologizing to her, and she insisted that it was okay, but I knew it wasn't. She sat at the kitchen table with me while she called my mom, who showed up 30 minutes later with the police. I assume my mom called the police because I remember my grandmother talking to her on the phone and saying that she didn't need to call anyone. My mom yelled at my grandmother for a while, and I had to talk to the police. As far as I know, they never found anyone, but after that, I wasn't allowed to spend the night at my grandmother's anymore.